Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of the War Films podcast, where we're discussing 10 classic war films. This episode we are going away from World War II, which has been, well, I think the majority of the ones we've done so far.
We had one Vietnam, one First World War.
Yes, most of them are World War II, but this time we're going back into the 19th century for one of Queen Victoria's colonial wars, into South Africa in 1879 with the film Zulu. I'm Garen Ewing. I'm a comic artist and writer and illustrator, and I'm doing these podcasts with my brother Murray Ewing.
Hello, I'm Murray. I'm a writer. I've got a book out at the moment called The Fantasy Reader. I also did the music for this podcast.
So, Zulu, have you seen this film before?
I must have.
Yes.
Apparently it's one of those classic Christmas time films.
Yes.
But I think I have seen it before, but I think this is the first time I sat down and watched it with intention. You know?
Right, yes. I think I'm the same. I've seen it quite a few times before, but particularly, as I've mentioned on our podcasts a few times, one of my, what I might call my specialist subjects, if I had to go on Mastermind, it might be one of my specialist subjects, was the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which took place between 1878 and 1880, so in exactly the same time period. And because of that, I was interested in seeing the film Zulu as well, because that's set in the same period, although a different continent, of course.
Yeah, so it was released in 1964.
Yes.
Although apparently research for the film started in the late 1950s. It all started with John Preble, who's a historian, wrote an article. He'd been writing articles about bravery in military situations.
Yes.
His wife suggested he look at the list of Victoria Crosses awarded as ideas, and he saw that 11 had been awarded at Rorke's Drift, which is the subject of Zulu. So he wrote an article on that.
It was called Slaughter in the Sun.
Oh, right.
And that was 1958.
A US director called Cy Enfield read it, and he bought the rights, basically.
Okay.
Basically, he and John Preble collaborated on the script from that point on.
Yeah.
Should we talk about Cy Enfield?
Yes. Yeah, well, as the film sort of starts with him,
Yeah.
I suppose, as the originator. Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
So he worked with Orson Welles. He's an American, I don't know if I said that.
Yeah.
Worked with Orson Welles, and of course that ended when Orson Welles himself had trouble with the studios. Then Cy Enfield was blacklisted because he was a communist, so he couldn't find work in America.
Right. Well, was he actually a communist or just...
That's the point. I think they said he was a communist. But,
Okay.
Well, communist sympathiser or what counted as...
Yeah, which probably wasn't, if you were left-handed, you were probably a communist sympathiser under McCarthy's view.
So obviously, I guess that's why he ended up in England or over here, looking to finance a film. So he got in. He was trying to find finance, and he came into contact with Stanley Baker, who's an actor. We covered him in The Guns of Navarone. He was had a starring part in that.
Played Butcher Brown, the knife expert, didn't he? Yeah,
yeah,
the slightly psychotic member of the team.
And that was 1961, and I think it was there that, I don't know if they came into contact then or around then, but Stanley Baker wanted to move into production as well as being a star actor at the time. And so he read the script, which they prepared, and he started getting contacts, getting people to finance it.
Right. Cy Enfield, he did a Tarzan film in 1952, Tarzan's Savage Fury. Which may have been his last film in the States, actually, because that was 52 and he moved to the UK in 53.
All right.
And in 1961, the year you just mentioned, he made Mysterious Island, the Ray Harryhausen film.
Right,
which is fantastic, based on
Jules
Verne, yes.
Yeah.
So Stanley Baker is really...
He was a driving force behind
He was a driving force, and also his profile... along with Michael Caine, was probably the most raised by this film.
Oh, right.
Zulu was enormously successful. It was Michael Caine's first kind of starring role in a film.
Definitely, yes.
And now Stanley Baker, he'd been in quite a number of films by then. Richard III, Hell Drivers in 57, which was directed by Cy Enfield. So, that was Stanley Baker's first lead role. I think Cy Enfield and Baker made 6 films together, so quite a number.
Yeah.
I'd say also in 1961, that year, that's when he made The Guns of Navarone, which was our first film in the War Films podcast. So if you want to go and look at our archive, you'll see our discussion of that film. And I think we talked about Stanley Baker had turned down the role of James Bond for the first Dr. No. Yeah. So you were saying about Joseph Levine was the finance?
Oh, yes, yeah. I remember I couldn't remember the name, but there was basically one finance.
Well, he was a big Hollywood mogul, wasn't he?
I think he said he thought the budget should be about 2.6 million, which was quite low for the time.
Right.
But he said if you can get it below 2 million, then you can basically start straight away.
Right.
Which they did.
Okay.
Which is amazing because I don't think it looks at all like a low-budget film, apart from the fact that it's all in one basic location.
Yes, yeah. Although it's in South Africa.
Yeah.
I presume it was filmed in Natal, was it?
Yeah, Natal. Yeah, and
so
in South Africa.
Pretty much on location. Probably not the exact location, I'm sure, but
there are a few things like some of the actors, like the bloke who plays Private Henry Hook. He is only
James Booth.
Yes, he's only seen in interiors, basically. So he wasn't shipped out to South Africa.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, no, you don't notice it until you're told, really.
Yeah.
But so, that's like they save money by not having to take him out.
That's amazing. I didn't notice that he wasn't... So was he never outside at all? Or?
There's one shot where he's on the roll call at the end... But because it's under...
he's sitting under the awning of
Yes. So you wouldn't notice it.
Right.
But, so...
the magic of filmmaking.
And also they did things like, they worked out that if a Zulu costume, if they bought it in England, would cost about £300. So they basically got the Zulus to make their own costumes.
Oh, what a good idea. Authenticity.
Yeah. Authenticity. They did use actual rifles, the actual Henry Martini rifles and things
Martini
like that.
Henry rifles.
Martini Henry, sorry.
Yeah, and another bit of authenticity is King Ketshwayo was played by...
Chief Buthelezi.
Yes, Chief Buthelezi, who was the great-grandson of Ketshwayo.
Yeah.
And, I mean, he wasn't an actor. He was a politician in South Africa. He... was the chief of the Buthelezi tribe. He was the leader of the KwaZulu territory. He founded the Inkatha Freedom Party in 1975, and in the first post-apartheid government in 1994, he was the Minister of Home Affairs in South Africa.
Oh, right.
So his Wikipedia page is long and and detailed, a fascinating character in the history of South Africa in recent formative years.
Yeah. Apparently his mother was quite a historian of Zulu culture.
Oh, right.
And things like the music, she provided recordings of authentic Zulu music, which I guess we'll talk about the soundtrack somewhere, but John Barry used actual Zulu music as a basis for his soundtrack.
I didn't look into the music at all on this, but it was notably good. In fact, I think... on one of the extras of the DVD, they said that the soundtrack made almost as much as the film itself because it was so popular.
Of course, at the time, in 1964, if you really liked a film, the only way you had to sort of take it home with you, you could buy a novelisation or the soundtrack.
Yes.
I think I've heard Mark Kermode say this about a lot. He'd he'd buy the soundtrack and sort of sit there reimagining the film to the music.
Yes,
but the basic theme of Zulu film is based on a rhythm taken from Zulu music.
Oh, right.
So it's got that sort of thumping rhythm.
Yeah. So the other main character is Michael Caine.
Yes.
As we said, in his first major role.
Yeah.
And really, after that, he just went from star to star, didn't he? Because he was followed by The Ipcress File and Alfie and The Italian Job and Get Carter.
Yeah.
And, of course, he's been in... We discussed The Man Who Would Be King.
Yes, yeah.
Which was 1975. That was in our Adventure Films podcast, which you can also listen to in our archive. And... the year after that, he was in The Eagle Has Landed, which I think is the next film we're discussing.
Yes, yeah.
And he was, in the year after that, so 3 consecutive years, 1977, he was in A Bridge Too Far, which we talked about 2 episodes ago.
Yeah.
So Michael Caine, a bit of a glut of Michael Caine there.
Yeah, it was his breakthrough role. And originally, apparently, he was thought of as being considered for Private Hook.
Right.
Now, a lot of the cast were cast because they were friends of Stanley Baker, which isn't to say it's nepotism.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the way they got the film done under budget. Yeah, not nepotism, isn't it? That's family. He needed reliable actors. They didn't want to waste money on people they didn't know. Caine was a sort of rising star actor, but he hadn't had a major film role. And after this, he really became known as a working class actor. I mean, that's what he is.
Yes.
And I think it was him who says that the reason he was cast as upper class is because Seinfeld, as an American, didn't know that it tended to be then that if you were upper class, you were cast in upper class roles, and if you were lower class, you were cast in...
So you didn't really know the class system that we have.
So, I mean, here he's playing very much against type, really.
Yes, it is funny when you see Michael Caine.
Yeah,
you're expecting,
the Cockney accent.
Blow the bloody doors off or whatever. Don't you point that bloody spear at me. Hang on. Well, is that an actual line? Did I just make that up?
No, I think that's a comedy.
Because that sounds like it should come from Zulu, but of course, when you hear him talk, he's hello, old chap. In fact, he says chin chin at one point, doesn't he?
He's absolutely aristocratic.
Only he's good. He's good actually. You get used to it quite quickly, but at first, when you know Michael Caine from Alfie and all the other stuff, it's a slight shock.
Yeah.
So yes, we've had quite a few Michael Caine, and our next film is Michael Caine as well. Michael Caine has actually been in a film with Stanley Baker in 1956. Oh, that was Caine's first film, actually.
Yeah, wasn't he a minor part or something?
Right, A Hill in Korea, it was called, which I guess was a Korean War film. It's about that period.
One major name in this film, of course, is Richard Burton, who you never see. He does the voiceover at the beginning and the end.
Yeah, I didn't recognise his voice rather badly, but I mean, it's obviously very recognisable.
I mean, Stanley Baker was Welsh, and that's one of the reasons he chose this script. He liked it because it's about a Welsh regiment, or a regiment that's based in Wales and mostly made out of Welsh people. And so a lot of the actors, like Richard Burton was brought in, partly as a favour. I mean, obviously he was paid, but because it was boosted by the idea of the Welsh idea. Yeah,
I think historically, though, they didn't become certainly a named Welsh regiment. I don't think until 1881 where all the regimental changes came in. But were they a Warwickshire?
Oh,
they
right.
were the Warwickshire regiment before then. I mean, they're all named. They were the 24th Foot.
Yeah.
Before 1881.
Yeah, certainly I read that. I mean, they're presented as being basically Welsh.
Yeah.
Of course, they've got
they have a large contingent of Welsh.
Yeah, and they sing
privates.
The Men of Harlech, which is a Welsh song, which wasn't the regimental song at the time, and it wasn't predominantly Welsh apparently.
But you can imagine the Welshmen in the regiment might have sang that anyway. I mean, it did become the regimental song, and I presume it just didn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah,
I should say, by the way, me having an interest in the Anglo-Afghan War, I've kind of shunned the Zulu War because it's kind of the rival. And there's possibly a bit of jealousy from people who prefer who are into the Anglo-Afghan War, of which there aren't many. Because, for instance, when you go to the National Army Museum, or certainly the last time I went, 3 years ago or so, you look for books that are in your interest, mine being the Afghan War. You will find nothing. Any bookshop, there's nothing. There's probably more now. When I started studying the Afghan War, there was absolutely nothing around. It was people hardly knew about it. Of course, then we went into Afghanistan in 2001 or 2. I don't know how early we went. I can't remember. And even then, actually, there wasn't that much interest until about later in the 2000s, and more books have come out. So you might be able to find a couple now, but predominantly it was Zulu War. If you know the 1870s, 1880s, Zulu, there are so many books. Go online trying to find Afghan War stuff. Again, there's a bit more now. I've got my own website on the Afghan War, actually. But you'd find, looking for 1879, you'd find Zulu everywhere. There's forums, there's groups. And I, being interested in that era, I would look into them with some jealousy of the discussions going on about all the sort of details, but also the arguments. So, I don't know, I haven't looked at them for a while, but I do remember some 24-page forum thread about ammunition boxes at San Juan at that kind of level, which has made me slightly nervous about doing this film because I'm aware of the passion and
the level of information.
The level of knowledge that some people have about the Zulu War, and I just don't have. I've kind of avoided it because it's my rival, which is a silly way. It's not. I'm interested in it as well, but you get into being into this. I'm sort of into the India-Afghanistan border, and this is Africa, a completely different thing, but very interesting nonetheless. And I also have a friend, a comic creator friend, Colin Matheson, who I think one of his earliest, if not his first comic, maybe, I'm not sure, sorry Colin, did a really good little 2-part comic called Zulu Watercart Rescue about, I think, a real event that took place during the Rorke Drift action of a couple of soldiers or so going over the fortification to go and rescue a water cart that was out in the... to bring it back so they had more water. Anyway, it's a really good little comic. I recommend you look up Colin, and I think he's doing a new version, a full colour version of his Zulu comic, and perhaps some new pages as well, which I've seen. But anyway, so he really knows his stuff. He's been out to South Africa with Ian Knight, who's one of the foremost authors on the Zulu War and Rorke's Drift in particular. So I'm slightly nervous about making any factual claims in this podcast.
And to make things worse, one thing, I was listening to the commentary on the film, and a lot of it was, that didn't actually happen, or like the characterizations of some of the major characters in the film are completely not like the historical people. In fact, they've said, the family was upset about how he presented this person. Hook especially. I mean, that's one of the things I'd read on this forum as well, so I already knew that going to the film, that Hook's family. But of course, I mean, I don't know how well known it is what his character actually was. Families are always going to be disappointed with less than stunning. I mean, he's presented as a malingerer, and he's called a barrack room barrister or something. Someone who was trying to get out of doing,
He looks like a shirker in the film, doesn't he? He does eventually...
I mean, he wins a VC.
He grabs her, and he, deserves it from the events in the film, rescuing people from the fire and all that kind of stuff. And
So in this, we're basically discussing the film and the story of the film. We might occasionally make reference to the historical accuracy.
We will attempt to stumble over a few historical facts as we go along. With that in mind, we'll start talking about the film. Our usual disclaimer that this contains spoilers. It doesn't usually matter because we're usually discussing quite old films, but if you haven't seen it and well, it's an historical event, so you may know what happens. So our 2 disclaimers, spoilers, and also we're quite ignorant about historical facts. But we'll try our best because they are interesting. So the film starts after the Battle of Isandlwana. Which was a huge disaster for the British. They had, I think it was...
1,500 British men killed by a highly disciplined attack by Zulus.
Yes. 20,000 Zulus versus 1,800 British.
Oh, right.
And 1,300 of those British were killed. I mean, that's, almost a wipeout. That was the first battle of the Zulu War, and it didn't go well.
Should we say why the British were over there? Because this was... While I was watching the film, I didn't know this.
Yes, it's important, I guess, the background. So why were they there?
Well, basically, South Africa at the time wasn't a unified nation. There were Boers over there. There were Zulus and various other people who were actually native to South Africa, and there were British colonies, farmers and so on. And so Queen Victoria, sorry, I don't want to be familiar.
Vicky.
Queen Victoria sent over Sir Bartle Frere, telling him to organise South Africa into a nation. He saw the only thing stopping him really was the Zulus, who had a standing army of 40,000.
Right.
And so he tried to convince Queen Victoria basically to start the war, and she didn't want to. I think they were concentrating on Afghanistan, or the Russians anyway. I mean, Afghanistan wasn't a war then.
So
but,
the Prime Minister was Disraeli at the time, and he also didn't want to.
No.
Even though the Tories, of which Disraeli was leader of the Tories, I think that's right, they were basically the hawks of the day.
Oh, right.
And it was Gladstone, his rival, and they sort of swapped prime minister, being prime minister for a number of years. The Liberals were more wanted, not peace necessarily, but
they weren't so expansionist.
Yes, exactly.
But I think nobody wanted...
You had the forward policy of Disraeli, and I can't remember the name of the other one, the live and let live perhaps policy of Liberals, and that was manifested in Afghanistan, where they pretty much manufactured a reason to go to war with the Afghans, who they didn't want the Russians to have influence over them. They wanted the British to have influence over them. And this is pretty much mirrored in South Africa, except I think it's worse. It's difficult to say worse, putting your troops where they're not, supposed to be, really. They've got no right to be.
But basically, they didn't want a war in Africa.
No.
But Sir Bartle Frere apparently exaggerated the Zulu threat, and when he was finally told, no, you're not going to have a war, he forced events by going to Cetewayo and demanding that his army would be disbanded.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that kicked off the war.
He was prodding him quite a lot, wasn't he? He was issuing demands, a whole list of things that he knew he wouldn't be able to agree with.
Yeah.
It wasn't things that he wanted him to sign and then everything would be okay.
He was provoking him.
He made them impossible to agree with, and I think Cetewayo did quite a lot to try and keep the peace, actually.
Well, in the end, it wasn't Cetewayo who ordered the attack on Isandlwana.
Yeah.
It was I think it was his brother-in-law or something.
Oh, okay.
There was a prince who actually took the initiative and made this attack, which basically started the war. I mean, after that many people are killed, it's almost you can't stop a war.
Yeah.
But in the film, so we start off actually at the royal kraal, Cetewayo overseeing the marriage of
a mass marriage.
Yeah, mass marriage. The thing that impressed me about this was, even though it was a marriage, it was a wedding between warriors and women. It was showing sort of like regimentation. It was showing that these weren't disordered tribes.
Yes.
Just part of their everyday life was this extreme organisation.
Yes, and witnessing our two unusual faces to see in this scene, which are a couple of a Swedish missionary and his daughter. The Wits.
The Wits, yeah. Jack Hawkins playing the Swedish missionary. I think I know the name, and I guess I know the face. I don't really know the films he was in, but he was a leading man of, the decade before.
Yes, in fact, he's been in 2 films that we've discussed.
Oh, has he?
Yes. Well, no, one film that we've discussed already, Lawrence of Arabia.
Oh, right.
Listen in our archive. And one film we're going to discuss, in fact, it'll be the last of the war films, which is Bridge on the River Kwai.
Oh, right.
There's a couple of interesting links here between Jack Hawkins and Stanley Baker.
Yeah.
Not pleasant ones.
Oh, right.
They were both heavy smokers, and they both died of cancer related to that. So with Stanley Baker, he died of lung cancer in 1976. He was only 48.
Yeah.
That's pretty much a year older than I am. And Jack Hawkins, who was also a heavy smoker, had to have his larynx removed in 1966, so after Zulu. But he continued to act, and his voice was dubbed in. Amazingly.
Really?
But he died after an operation to fit an artificial voice box in 1973. And just related to that, Stanley Baker played Lieutenant Chard. Chard was also a heavy smoker, as probably many people were back in those days.
Yeah.
Chard died of cancer of the tongue and had to have his tongue removed. And then he died in 1897, age 49, so just a year older than Stanley Baker. So I think Stanley Baker felt quite a strong connection to Chard.
Yeah.
And in fact, he owned his Victoria Cross.
Yeah.
He bought it thinking it was a cast copy.
Yeah.
And then, 20 years after his death or so, in 1996, it was discovered that it was actually the original
VC.
Made from the cannon of Crimea, was it? Chinese cannon used by Russians in the Crimea.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that ended up eventually in the collection of Lord Ashcroft, who's got the biggest collection of VCs ever, and I think they're at the Imperial War Museum now. Anyway, interesting story. So back to the Wits. So they witness with slight distaste.
Yeah.
Perhaps trying to be culturally interested, but especially his daughter is horrified at this display of flesh and music, rhythm, and it's quite a fantastic contrast with their buttons done up right to their tops, and their,
despite the heat.
Their biblical view of the world, and then suddenly here's this nature, happening. These people who live with nature, and it's quite a joyful and very powerful scene, and they can't quite stand it.
Yes,
and then in comes a messenger who tells. Now, what does he say? Is he giving Cetewayo the news about Isandlwana?
The massacre, yeah.
Right, yes.
Well, immediately the Wits start to leave, and Otto Witt says there's just been over 1,000 British soldiers killed. Yes, so they trying to leave. They get into their little carriage, and one of the Zulus stops Margareta Witt, and Cetewayo orders him killed, just to let them go. Which, and there's another detail I didn't really notice, but when the wagon rolls away, it goes over a bump, and that's the Zulu who was just killed.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because apparently this was something that might have upset the censors of the day. I mean, I just thought, it's gone over a bump.
That wasn't an accident of film.
No, that's supposed to be taken as they're just running over a dead man.
Right. Goodness me.
Yeah, so they leave.
And they go to Rorke's Drift.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the historical inaccuracies, because they weren't actually at Rorke's Drift, were they?
Apparently it was 2 days away. Oh, you see, the Wits weren't based. They weren't based at Rorke's Drift, and they weren't pacifists, apparently.
No. But did they even go to Rorke's Drift? Or is that? Or are they just used as a... I mean, obviously it's quite a dramatic...
Yeah.
They have quite an impact, because they turn up at Rorke's Drift, and there's... Otto Witt going, "You're all going to die," and he turns out to be a drunkard. He gets drunk, and eventually they're just put on their carriage and told to leave, despite the fact that they're surrounded by Zulus, just because he's too much trouble. Yeah,
they play an important dramatic role in the build up to the attack. But Rorke's Drift. It wasn't filmed at the actual location of Rorke's Drift, because apparently they went there and they said it was basically two hills. It was quite flat.
Yeah.
Whereas where the place this film was filmed is very dramatic, mountains and hills, and it looks brilliant. It looks brilliantly dramatic, but you think you wouldn't really build a hospital there, because it's basically in a place that's perfect to be attacked from every direction.
Yeah. But, I mean, Rorke's Drift itself was originally a trading post.
Yes.
And then was it a mission station?
Yeah, I mean, it was a hospital, as in...
And then it was being used as a hospital by the army for their... I think it was right on the border of...
Zululand.
The Zululand, across the river, which is... We then go to Rorke's Drift, and we meet Lieutenant Chard, Stanley Baker, who is a Royal Engineer, and has just been sent there to...
He was part of the people who were massacred, but he was sent ahead of them to build a bridge.
He didn't know about that.
Yeah. So he basically escaped being killed by being sent ahead to build a bridge so that they could cross it.
And he's using men of the Rorke's Drift garrison, the 24th Foot.
Yeah.
And I think historically his engineers had been sent away back to Sandalwana, so were involved in that, and he was left with the men of the 24th. I don't know the truth of all those men swapping.
It's interesting how many of these films feature bridges, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, this isn't a major part of the film, but it's blowing up bridges, building bridges.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so the actual man who's in charge of the 24th, who are at Rorke's Drift, is Lieutenant Bromhead.
Yeah.
Who's Michael Caine.
Yes.
Bromhead is aristocratic. His grandfather is the general, he calls him.
Yeah.
And his father was also, high up in the army.
Yeah, they've been at places like
Quebec
and Waterloo.
Yeah.
So he's got that, and that's real.
It's in his blood.
Yeah, which is very, very a familiar story for officers, gentlemen officers.
Yeah.
Whereas Chard has not come through that sort of familiar.
He's an engineer, so you assume that he's educated from, maybe working class background, probably middle class.
Yeah.
And so he's earned his position rather than being born to it. That's the sort of argument between them. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about Chard, but certainly Bromhead purchased his commission. Yeah, so when they meet, you get that
tension
between them, because Bromhead is immediately lording it over Chard.
Yeah. Chard has borrowed some of his men, didn't ask.
Yeah.
And
Bromhead's out hunting.
Yeah, hunting a leopard or something.
A cheetah.
Yes. And he's very much, he's got his servants, and he brushes down his cloak. He says, "Best to look. You've got to look your best in front of the men."
Yeah.
Whereas Chard is
just in the river.
Yeah, he's down to his knees and elbows in the water.
Yeah.
So there's immediate contrast between them, which is good, because that's the sort of dramatic conflict that gets us to the attack. Really,
and what makes it really interesting is the inverted commas natural order of things is that Bromhead is the superior. I look down on him. But when they discuss their army list credentials, so when
they were enlisted,
commissioned,
that's it.
They discover that Chard was commissioned in. Well, first of all, he asks Bromhead, and he says May 1872.
Yeah,
and Chard
says 1872
February.
Yeah,
so a couple of months before, which makes him the superior officer.
Yeah,
despite being an engineer.
I think you better get them out of here.
You giving me an order, old boy?
Bromhead. Let's get one thing clear. I'm no line officer, I'm an engineer. I came here to build a bridge.
Jolly lucky for you, eh? I mean, otherwise, you would have been chopped with the rest of the column, wouldn't you?
All right. What's the date of your commission?
Now, don't tell me. I suppose you have seniority. 1872, May.
1872, February.
Oh, well. I suppose there are such things as gifted amateurs. If I may
Are you questioning my right to command?
Oh, not your right, old boy. Never mind. We can cooperate, as they say.
Actually, historically, Bromhead purchased his commission as an ensign in 1867, and Chard was commissioned in July 1868.
Oh.
But Bromhead didn't become a lieutenant until 1871. So it wasn't a matter of months. Chard became a lieutenant 3 years before Bromhead.
Oh, right.
So was not only just the superior, he was definitely superior by a matter of years, despite the fact that Bromhead had got into the army earlier.
Oh, it's good. I think it's interesting they do that in the film because it makes it seem as though, it could have gone either way.
Oh, it's good. It's good. I mean, okay, it's not historically accurate, and that's the point about a lot of the things in this film. It's interesting knowing what's not historically accurate, and actually, I think it's okay. I know some people probably think it's terrible, but it does make it more dramatic. I mean, I don't know. This is something that's across many of these war films is
it's myth making, isn't it?
Is it right to meddle around with history? Something like A Bridge Too Far, which we talked about, was very accurate, I think. I mean, obviously you can't be totally, but it was almost like a documentary, as we discussed.
Yeah.
And then you get things like this, which definitely goes for the good old adventure story, a boy's own adventure story, rather than the documentary type thing.
It brings out the drama of the situation rather than being historically accurate. Yeah, so they're trying to build a bridge.
Well, we might as well jump to now. So they know the Zulus are coming, and so we've had this discussion about the order of superiority. So who's going to take command? The Zulus are marching on from their victory in Sandalwana, high on their victory, coming towards Rorke's Drift. We know there's about between 3,000 and 4,000 Zulus.
Yeah.
Rorke's Drift has about 150 men, 140 men, including 30 sick and wounded because it's a hospital.
Yeah.
Now, they did have 350 men, but the 3rd Natal native contingent abandoned camp. That happens in the film when... I keep wanting to call him DeWitt.
Yeah.
But Otto Witt,
yeah.
I think at this point slightly drunk,
comes
out and says, leave, and he appeals to their Christian nature. I don't know if they were Christians. They possibly had been converted by all these missionaries, but...
As far as Witt's concerned,
he panics them.
Yeah, this is all part of his parish. Yeah. He and his daughter turn up saying, "Oh, we're going to take the sick and wounded away." But of course, by this point, Stanley Baker's character Chard is saying, "Well, we're going to need them, even though they're sick." So he says, "You're not going to do that," basically. So there's a conflict between the two of them. And I think Witt's character has a role to play here in that because he's so pacifist and also slightly panicking because he's saying you're all going to die. Because the big question is, why are they staying here? They're basically staying here because they've got orders to.
Right.
They could just run and save their lives, surely, and abandon the place and send the sick and wounded off with a...
Well, I don't know if they would. That must be a consideration that if they leave, especially with all the sick and wounded, there's a very good chance that they could be overtaken by...
Yeah, I suppose
and then they'd have nowhere
yeah.
to defend. They'd be out in the open, or I mean, how far away are they from anywhere they could defend? So it's probably the only practical solution.
Yeah. But I thought watching the film that Witt, by being so, not pacifist, but so, you know, the viewer is against him, and so you're with the soldiers. Yes. It sort of cements your relationship with the soldiers, and the fact that they've got to stay and they've got to put up with this.
Yes.
Just because he's so... It's basically cowardly. I don't know. I don't really want to say cowardly.
No, I understand what you mean.
But once he starts drinking and starts saying, you're all going to die, you're all going to die, it does come across as slightly cowardly.
Yeah, he loses any authority he might have had, any moral authority he might have had.
Whereas in contrast to him is, I think, one of the best characters in the film, which is Colour Sergeant Bourne.
Yes.
who
All right,
comes
you
across.
lovely boys. He's a bit of a Windsor Davis.
Yeah, he's just like a father to all the people below him. You know, he knows exactly the right tone. He doesn't hector anyone. He just says it. You know. And
historically, I think he was one of the youngest colour sergeants they had. He was 24 or something.
Yes,
but in this, he's more like he's sort of 50.
Yeah,
one of the old hands. And I did think it was odd he was wearing his medals.
Oh right.
Which I don't think he would.
Yeah.
I don't know what the medals were. One of them looked like South African War medal, but
they normally just have the ribbons, the little.
Yeah. I guess it's an identifier. It gives him some form of authority. It shows he's had experience, which wasn't necessarily historically accurate, but you do get that. As you say, paternal character.
Yeah.
But he's good, isn't he? He's played by Nigel Green, and he was in Jason and the Argonauts, by the way, a Harryhausen film. He played Hercules, and later he was in the Ipcris File.
He was definitely a recognisable face, but I couldn't pinpoint where he came from.
Yeah, probably the Ipcris File is one of his most famous roles.
Yeah,
I think he played Michael Caine's superior.
There's another character who gets introduced here who I thought, I don't recognise that face, but I couldn't, which is Private Thomas, played by Neil McCarthy.
Right.
He's got quite a long, sort of heavy featured face. Who's been in a film that we covered in the Adventure Film podcast, which is Time Bandits.
Okay, who was he?
I can't remember. I think he was he was a bandit. That's it. He's a bandit. Oh, part of
not one of the
Robin Hood's
little people.
No, no, part of Robin Hood's men, I think.
Okay,
but the thing that I was looking at him thinking, I suddenly realised where I'd seen him before in a major role,
right,
in a film which I think hopefully both like. Clash of the Titans.
Oh, right, yeah. I can't even picture who you're talking about, to be honest.
Calibos. I
was going to say Calibos, because I probably wouldn't recognize.
Yeah, because he's in makeup.
Oh, I know who you mean now.
He's got a really sort of strong nose. And
yes, he's got that sort of... He looks a little bit like... Did he play a Bond villain as well? Because he's got that... I don't know. I didn't look him up, I'm afraid. But yeah, he's that kind of sort of either a gentle giant or the henchman.
Yeah.
Or obviously
a
monster. Monster from Hades, yeah.
But in here we see him, he's very much a gentle Welshman we see he's trying to look after a calf that's recently been born.
That's right, yeah. Which isn't just a small detail, because that has an impact later.
It has an impact later.
But he's sent out with one of the other soldiers, the head of the choir, to go and keep a lookout.
Yeah,
and it's interesting. They're up on this hill of green and largely brown, kind of dry, dusty.
Grass.
These two bright red
Yeah.
British soldiers. I just go, how ridiculous. It's interesting that they were all wearing red in Africa, whereas in Afghanistan, they pretty much all converted to khaki.
Oh, really?
But it was still very early days for khaki. They didn't necessarily all have khaki-made uniforms. They had to dye them with either tea or mud. So the British Army in Afghanistan had everything ranging from dark brown to almost bright yellow, depending on how they dyed them.
Right.
They were almost responsible themselves for dyeing them, or certainly on a regimental level. But in Africa, still that British bright red,
Yes,
we don't have to hide. We're British.
Yeah, the man he goes up to the hill to watch with is Private Owen, played by Ivor Emmanuel, who was a singer rather than actor, and this is his only acting performance.
He did have a very nice voice in the film, because he gets some singing done, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yes.
So the next thing that happens is while Chard is organising... Well, actually, we've got another character who's Ardendorf, who plays...
Is he the Boer?
The Boer, yeah.
Yes.
He acts as the sort of interpreter of what the Zulus are planning.
Yes, he knows, I'm a Boer. The Zulus are enemies of my blood. What are you doing here? He says.
Yeah. So he explains the Zulu tactic of the bull's head.
Yes.
Where they sort of lure you in between the horns. They lure you into the head. The head splits into horns and surrounds you.
And circling.
Yes. Yeah, so he's important for telling us exactly what's going on, and basically telling us that this isn't just an attack by savages, but by a highly organised army. You know exactly what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So I think
it is interesting actually when he says, I'm a Boer, the Zulus are enemies of my blood, and Bromhead says something like, or you don't mind our help, I hope.
Yeah.
And he says it depends what you want to do with it afterwards, meaning the land, I suppose, because the Boers had their own claim as well. Of course, I mean, going back to why we're in Africa, going back even further, why we're in Africa. Yeah. South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, was at the time the British route to India,
right?
Which was the jewel in the crown.
Yeah.
And of course, the Boers are of, I think, Dutch descent, aren't they?
Yeah.
And the Dutch East India Company also had
a main rival.
Yeah, in fact, I think they beat the British there. So there was conflict there. So there was whoever controlled the Cape.
Yeah.
Also controlled the route to India at the time because there wasn't the Suez Canal.
Yeah. Which then became another knot of imperial dominance and difficulty.
Yeah. So that's going way back too, but it is kind of the source, I guess. I mean, I don't know if that's the main reason. There are other reasons as well. Just the British wanted to be everywhere.
Yeah.
Look, there's no white people here. This must be ours.
Yes. Let's see what we can get out of it. So some farmers come, and Chard is really happy, but then they say, no, if we're going to die, we're going to die on our own farms, and they go off.
Yes.
So we really feel as though...
Which is the meaning of the word Boer, by the way, which is farmer.
Oh, right. So we really feel as though the men are on their own now. And that's when the news comes that thousands of Zulus are spotted.
Yes.
And it's brilliant the way they're introduced, because they're heard rather than seen.
Yes. What does Bromhead say? It's like a train.
Yeah. Apparently Bromhead in reality was deaf. Or pretty much deaf, so he wouldn't have said that. This is another one of those sort of puncturing facts. Did anything happen? And this is one of the things about the Zulus. They use pretty much psychological warfare as much as... Well, not as much as warfare, but, they stand there, not taunting, or it's just a display of strength, but it is truly frightening.
I mean, even just watching the film, there's a sense of awe that comes from all these voices, very powerful, and the rhythmic thumping of their shields and feet.
Echoing around the hills, so you probably feel as though it's all around you.
I mean, can you imagine being in this tiny little place with 150 men surrounded by a few thousand Zulu impi, and... I mean, you do feel it.
Yeah. Now, the short spears they've got, apparently, normally you think of Zulu with an assegai, which is a long spear.
Oh, right.
Apparently what happened is Ketchueo he was invited to Ladysmith, which is where the British Army had its base, and he saw he was invited to watch the British Army training. Okay. And he saw them training with bayonets, and he realised that his men, if they fought the British, would be in close-up combat, and so they developed this spear. Basically, this shorter spear was developed specifically to fight the British in bayonet combat.
I didn't know that. Right? Yeah. So there is a point where they, I don't know if it's before the Zulus actually arrive, where they think that a relief column is coming, so they're all starting to look a bit happier. And this is Durnford's horse, who have, I guess, come from Isandlwana, survived and escaped. Right. And Chard says, "We need you," and he says, they basically say, "No way, we're not staying."
Yeah, that's the farmers. Yeah, if we're going to die, we're going to die on our own farms.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. And then Chard starts organising the barricades. So they've got all these sacks of grain.
Yeah, I think he calls them meal sacks.
Right. Yeah. So they're
the
things that go out around. They start building them.
Yeah, he arranges it so there's not just an outside barrier, but there's an inner redoubt which they can retreat to.
Yes, is that the biscuit boxes? Because that's what I always... that's one fact I sort of remembered or knew from perhaps even boyhood, reading something about it, was that it was a defence and all the soldiers were behind biscuit boxes. Right. But in the film, I think that's only the central bit, so that they can retreat to that if the outer perimeter is breached.
Yeah. So we get the Zulus' first attack.
Zulus to the southwest, thousands of them. Yeah. There's a few lines in this that I think, I remember that. That's one of them. Thousands of them.
They're trailer moments, aren't they?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So the Zulus attack, and they're gunned down, but they kill some of ours, I was going to say, kill some British.
There's an interesting thing at first where the Zulus come in, but they're not really attacking. Yeah. And it turns out, and the British are firing, and it turns out what they're doing is counting the guns of the British.
But one thing about that is that there's enough... The Zulus know they've got enough men to waste some, just working out how... Not waste them, but use them to work out the enemy's weaknesses. Yeah. Whereas amongst the British, every man counts. They can't afford to waste anyone or sacrifice anyone. That's something that Ardendorf says... after the first Zulu retreat, we killed 60 of them, Bromhead says, and it's like, we must have seen them off. Yeah. And Ardendorf says, no, he's just counting your guns.
Yeah. And there's another good line. I think Whit is drunk, and as he's been shoved off, cause he's just sort of panicked the Natal native contingent who have run, so they pack him and his daughter off, and as he's going, "You're all going to die," and the private says to the colour sergeant, "Why us? Why us?" And he says, "Because we're here, lad.
Yeah.
Nobody else. Just us."
Yeah.
It's pretty philosophical.
Yeah.
It doesn't really answer the why, but it's a good answer. This fatalistic.
It's also perfectly in character because he does his duty basically, and that's what everyone here is doing. Their duty. They've been ordered to stay here and they've got to defend this place. Yeah, it doesn't really matter outside of that why. There's a lot of historical background, but really it is because they're there. Yes. I mean, that is the reason.
Yes. This thing of fate, and in fact, I'm just going to jump a bit because it falls under this topic. As you said, 11 Victoria Crosses were won. Yeah. And a lot of the higher-ups in the army were not happy about this.
Oh, really?
And resented, particularly, well, any of them getting the VCs, but particularly Chard and Bromhead, who several statements were made that they were useless and, didn't deserve it. And, I mean, probably a lot of jealousy, but there is that point. The point being, did they deserve the VCs? I think, yes, they did, undoubtedly. Under that system. But they had no choice. They didn't put their lives, go out of their, like, for instance, other VCs were earned quite often for someone rescuing another soldier. Right. So you'd be perhaps running from the enemy. You'd see one of your...
so you'd go back towards
the enemy. Risk your life to rescue someone. Or, like in the First World War, some British Tommy would single-handedly take 11 German prisoners and a machine gun. Yeah. This was different. They had no choice but to stay there. They could have been complete cowards, but of course, what do? You fight. Yeah. And so there was resentment about the VCs. So that line of because we're here, is just it's the circumstances you're in. Yeah, and I think that's very interesting.
Of course, it was an unfortunate situation to be in the first place, anyway. So
yes, so there's a second wave attack, isn't there?
Yeah. Now, apparently, in the historical situation. The Zulus got into the compound 6 times.
Oh, right.
Yeah, which I think is more... But more of them... Quite a few of them happened at night. And, of course, they didn't... Yes. There's not much night coverage in this.
No, it's sort of one night scene where not much... Anyway, with the second wave, we discover... Although we knew it earlier, I think, that the Zulus have guns, which they took from the British soldiers at Sandalwana.
That's a brilliant moment when you see a Zulu. I think he drops his shield and he's holding up a rifle. Yeah, yeah. I don't know why. It's just so...
I don't know, maybe they had them anyway, but you did see them take them at the beginning. You see the aftermath of Sandalwana and they're raiding the bodies.
He gets the rifle,
And the Zulus get right up to the perimeter and you see this hand-to-hand fighting, which, I got to admit, I didn't feel... This is maybe because it's an older film. It seemed very choreographed, the hand-to-hand fighting, and you could plainly see, with the exception of a few direct stabs into obviously some kind of cardboard box in the... Those were quite good, but there were quite a few just stabs to empty air or just touching the body, and it was kind of obvious.
Well, this is one thing they said in the commentary is, for instance, they didn't leave loads of bodies lying around because they didn't want it to look like a bloodbath.
Right.
And they were saying that, and basically it wasn't done at the time to do lots of blood and guts.
Yeah, although it was quite bloody.
Yeah. And it's not until the very end of the film that there's lots of dead bodies obviously lying there. Yeah. So obviously in reality, it would have been a complete butcher's shop.
Yes.
But, that wasn't their aim, even though it was...
But it was pretty desperate. I mean, you do get a sense of, how can they even survive this as they're coming over? But there's other bits. It just doesn't seem very desperate. The situation is desperate, certainly. I did feel tension. But the individual little fights, you'd quite often get sold. It just looked a bit too casual in some ways.
Yeah.
No, that's a horrible criticism because... okay, so... And then there's a third wave of attack. They draw back. There's a third wave. And Chard, who I think was injured in the second wave and has been into the surgeon and come out again and kind of rallies himself.
Yeah.
And forms lines out of his British soldiers. So they do the volleys, where... One line kneels down and fires, and then as they're reloading, the line behind fires, and they move forward. And that really shows you the British tactics
Yeah.
coming into play and how successful they are.
Yeah. There's quite a good moment before that where Charge, injured, says to Bromhead, "You're the professional, take command."
Yeah.
But Bromhead says, "No, we need you." So it's
Right.
like he's acknowledging the fact that he thinks Bromhead is the better man to be in charge.
Yes.
Or at least, he's doing a good job.
And of course, at the end, we learn, certainly in the film version, that this is Bromhead's first action. And then I think we also learn that it's Child's first action.
Yeah, that's the point, yeah.
I think historically, I'm not sure. I think Bromhead had been in action before.
And there's one point which I think is like a bit too much on the message, which is in the surgery. Patrick McGee, who's the surgeon, is operating on this man who sits up and goes, "Why? I'm damned if I can tell you why."
Yeah.
Patrick McGee, I found out, is Samuel Beckett's favourite actor, apparently.
Oh, okay. right. Yeah, he's stuck in the church. I don't know, was there a chapel there? I guess there probably was, but it was a mission, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Whereas I think in reality he was very much outside, going around people, seeing to them, and he won one of the VCs, which makes more sense.
Yeah.
If he's outside, under fire and the threat of death, whereas if he's in the church, isn't. Well, I guess he still produced sterling work.
Yeah.
Well done, old chap. Yeah, the Zulus get onto the roof
Yes.
of the hospital, which is thatch, and they dig their spears in and get down into the building, but also a fire starts on the roof, and that's obviously devastating for the hospital and the people in it because the whole thing catches.
There's two facts I learned about the actual events.
Right.
One is that most of the wounds to the British were gun wounds, bullet wounds, rather than spear wounds.
Oh, okay.
And the other is that most of the fatalities occurred in the hospital.
Oh, right.
Because, of course, there no one could run.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, not that people were running, but, I mean, they were sitting ducks, basically.
Yeah. Oh, God, right. And this is where Hook has been shown to be a shirker and a insubordinate and, not at all...
Doesn't follow orders.
He gets his turnaround.
Yes, yeah.
Where he's even during the battle, he's
not firing.
No.
Until another private says, would you join it? Well, as you ask, he doesn't want to follow orders, but
Right.
he's sort of like, he's waiting for an excuse to not follow orders, but still join in.
Right, yes, that's good.
Yeah.
But he even his hated, I don't know
Private
what he is.
Maxfield. Sergeant Maxfield.
Sergeant,
sorry.
who's quite wounded.
He's in fever.
He rescues him, although he doesn't make it. Yeah. And it was quite funny as he's dying. He says, "I've made a soldier of you at last." He's laughing.
Yeah.
But Hook does quite a lot in there to help get everyone out.
Yeah.
He takes a swig of, smashes the medicine cabinet and takes a swig of medicinal brandy or whatever it is.
On the way out. Yeah.
One of the things his family didn't like, because they claim he was a teetotaler.
Oh, right.
But I think even a teetotaler, perhaps, in that situation, might not be able to resist a... Because it's not like he was like the missionary who had his secret stash of brandy. He just needed a quick...
Yeah.
So I don't think it necessarily showed him as a drunkard of any kind.
No.
Although in the film he was given 28 days
without pay.
Yeah. I don't know if it was field punishment or something.
Yeah, Maxfield called him a thief, so I wonder if maybe.
Right, so it probably wasn't drunkenness. But I mean, his family said I think that he was an exemplary soldier, and one of the others who was seen in the film as an exemplary soldier was actually had a pretty bad
record.
Conduct record.
Oh, dear. That's quite an amazing action sequence. The whole hospital burning down.
Yes, it is.
Breaking through walls.
That really ramps up the tension, and I did feel that was a lot more visceral and realistic and edge of your seat stuff. And of course, because they're coming in through the doors and through the roof, and there's fire, and they're, as you say, they're in this enclosed space.
Now, what actually happened, of course, in the actual event is the hospital burnt down, but it meant that during the night attacks, because the hospital was still burning, they actually had illumination to see the enemy. So actually, it helped. I mean, not in a great way, but
so the Zulus couldn't creep up on them.
Because, at night they basically had a light to see the attacks. But the thing that stops this wave of attacks is something that was set up earlier when my Calibos actor went to check on his calf who was dead, and he didn't fully close the gate.
That's right, yeah.
And so, after a retreat to the inner redoubt, the Zulus are advancing, and then the cattle get loose.
Yeah.
And this causes a Zulu
just that
retreat.
the Zulus can't get to the perimeter to attack, and B, they're trampled.
Yes, yeah.
Do you know if that was a real event? Or...
I think... I've actually got a note. Didn't actually take place.
I thought it may not have.
Yeah.
That was very good as well, because the way it was filmed, they put a camera down on the ground, and it was really quite... You felt as though you were being trampled.
Yeah.
And probably very good editing, but there seemed to be a couple of Zulu warriors down there. One of them got gored by one of the cattle with its horns, and others got trampled.
I mean, you can see a problem for the filmmakers was making each Zulu attack different.
Yes.
And why did it end? Because, why do they end? They were just called back. You had to make it decisive and interesting.
Yeah, that's true. So we do see a night, and that's the following day, I think, isn't it? And no,
that's before.
Yeah, so then we have night with the fire still raging.
And we see only a few brief attacks, but I think it was probably just as bad during the night.
And in dawn, the Zulus chant and sing this, almost like, right, this is the big attack coming. And that's when the soldiers sing Men of Harlech in response.
It's sort of like a battle of singing, and you think, why can't all wars be resolved just by singing?
Yes. Instead of going into Iraq, we're going to have an X Factor.
Private Owen, he's asked, what do you think of their singing? He says, well, they've got a very good bass section, but no top tenors. And Men of Harlech is a song about a siege.
Right.
In 1461 at Harlech Castle.
Yeah.
So it's quite relevant to this.
I've just drawn Harlech Castle for a job, yes.
Oh, right. Yeah, so the Zulus do their chanting, and then there's one final attack.
Yes.
So we see all of the British, they're asleep at their posts, and they're woken up, and the Zulus chant, they attack. Chard gets the bugler to blow for the retreat behind the redoubt.
Yeah.
Now, something that said on the commentary is that the bloke on the commentary, who was the director of the second unit, 3 times said, "Oh no, this scene was based on an actual illustration from the London Illustrated News," and afterwards I couldn't be sure which one he meant, but I think he meant this one, which is a shot of 3 ranks of British soldiers, kneeling, standing, and behind the redoubt wall, firing against the final Zulu attack.
Yes, which was a real. I mean, it's almost like these visions of the machine guns.
Yeah.
Which I think the Maxim machine guns, who I know were first used in the Afghan War. Actually, probably not their first use, but very early use.
Yeah.
And I think were also used, had an early use in the South African War, but they weren't very reliable.
Yeah.
Although they were deadly machines, you could spray bullets, and just obviously indigenous peoples of these countries didn't stand a chance, except that they'd lock and misfire, and you couldn't get them working. Yeah. But here again, we've got the 3-line volley.
Yeah,
it just shows the devastation, because the Zulus just can't get through, can't get close enough, and this is where the bodies pile up. And it's quite a harrowing scene, actually, isn't it?
Yeah. So they retreat, and there's a feeling then that they've won, that the British have won.
Yeah. Is it this bit where they say the Zulus have gone, all of them, and someone says it's a miracle, and then is it the colour sergeant who says, "And debate it, sir," with some guts behind it, which I think is another famous line. I think there may have been a book about Rorke's Drift called "With Some Guts Behind It."
Yeah, I think it was about the making of this film, actually.
Oh, okay.
It's Colour Sergeant Bourne says it was a miracle. It's a miracle.
Yeah.
Chard says, it's can't remember the exact words, but he says it's basically a miracle based on the rifle.
Oh, right,
it's a 16 caliber, blah blah blah,
right,
miracle.
Martini Henry.
And then Bourne says, "And a bayonet, sir. It's got some guts behind it."
Yeah, he's a traditionalist.
Yeah. So I think also this is sort of answering Witt earlier, who's saying that the power of God would go through him, and saying it's not a miracle. It's down to actual people fighting.
Yes. A rationalist.
Yeah.
Oh, how nice.
And then we get a discussion between Chard and Bromhead for basically how they feel after. This is, like beforehand, of course, Bromhead was totally self-possessed, and he felt he knew there's nothing that
his breeding would see through.
War was in his blood, but now he's actually had some action. The character, not necessarily the historical person, but he says, I feel ashamed.
Well, you fought your first action.
Does everyone feel like this afterwards?
How do you feel?
Sick.
Well, you have to be alive to feel sick.
If you asked me, I told you. There's something else. I feel ashamed. Was that how it was for you? The first time?
First time? I think I could stand this butcher's yard more than once.
I didn't know.
I told you. I came up here to build a bridge.
There's a scene where they do a roll call of the men. The
Yeah.
Colour Sergeant Bourne does a roll call, which is quite moving. And I think you see he keeps his composure,
Yeah.
but you can see his swallows
It's
and perhaps
brilliantly
even a little bit of
acted.
moisture in his eyes. It's so
Yeah.
subtle, but that's probably one of the most emotional bits in the film.
Because you know that there's some names he know are dead,
Yeah,
some
he's
he's
reading them
hoping
out.
aren't dead.
It's just an
And then-
alphabetical list.
Yeah.
for
And there's
the
moments of
casualty.
humour, like he says, Hitch, I know you're not dead.
But yeah,
they're the
that's,
actual names as well, apparently. All of the names he calls out
Yeah.
are actual names, yeah.
you know, this is historical, but transpose it to today. Yeah, with the same things happening. These names are actual people, you know, with families back home, and yeah, this is people who've been killed for a stupid war, obviously.
And then there's a brilliant ending where
Oh yeah,
the Zulus reappear, and particularly Michael Caine's character, I think he's just going, oh my God, you know.
because they're
with-
happy that
yeah,
they've gone, they've made
think-
it, survived,
yeah.
and then
Yeah, and they know there's still
these
thousands.
lines
yeah.
appear again.
And so, but the Zulus start chanting, and this is the Boer. Michael Caine's character says they're taunting us. Ardendorf says no, they're saluting fellow braves.
Yeah,
Which apparently didn't happen.
no,
Apparently the Zulus did come back, and they were seen coming back, but they were just trying to get a look at the relief column, which was turning up.
right, okay,
So
yeah. Which is why they left.
Yeah.
So again, it goes back to that question of the Victoria Crosses and how worthy
yeah.
they are, certainly in other people's eyes, saying, well, you know, the only reason they left was because the relief, which is possibly true.
Yeah, but they
How
survived
many
that
more waves?
long.
They
Yeah.
did, yes, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
10 hours of fighting, I think,
Yeah.
which is incredible. 150 men against, 3,000 or 4,000.
Yeah. But I think this is what the film is about, really. It's not about the political situation.
No.
It's about soldiers being caught in, you know, they don't know why. They're just,
Yeah.
they're there. That's why they're
Exactly,
fighting.
which
And
is said, yeah.
both sides that we see here, we don't really see the people in charge.
No.
You know, it's braves, as he says, it's braves saluting fellow braves. You know, that's what this is about.
And, as you said, 11 VCs were won. I read that someone said there was no other action like it. And I've always thought that's a bit unfair, although it's possibly true. Being an Afghan war, I'm going to say advocate, which is not not a great phrase. There's an action in the Afghan war that happened 2 months after Rorke's Drift, which hardly anyone, no one really knows about. But I've always been fascinated by it for a number of reasons. But one of them is its similarity to Rorke's Drift, and it was in April 1879, and it was called Cam Dacca. The action of Cam Dacca, where a British officer and his Marawa battalion of Indian native soldiers and some British, I think, of the 12th Foot or something, went out to a small village on the Kabul River to find out what was happening. There'd been some incursions by some Moman tribesmen. And anyway, the villagers who they thought were friendly turned out not to be. Captain O'More Creer, I think his name was, who's a fascinating person. I actually read his autobiography, and he's a really nice bloke. I mean, I think he's very admirable because he treated his Indian soldiers, he was friends with them.
Yeah.
And they respected him, whereas he wasn't their actual commander. He was something like the second in command. Their actual commander treated the Indians like complete inferiors, like many of the officers did, unfortunately, and was off hunting, leaving Creer, or went off to find some more. I can't remember the details now. He was away from because he didn't really like staying with the soldiers, and I think he got himself moved away from the battalion to find some slightly more glorious action.
Oh, right.
As it turned out, O'More Creer had the glorious action in inverted quotes. So the villagers attacked them, and him and his 100 men, some British, some majority Indian, I think, retreated to the cemetery just outside the village. And it was this is the main difference. In Rorke's Drift, there were 3,000 or 4,000 Zulus.
Yeah.
In this one, I think there were about 1,000 Afghan tribesmen still.
Yeah.
But they kept them at bay at this cemetery.
Yeah.
No, they didn't have a wall or anything. And I think, so Kamdaka, about 150 men, the British lost 6 dead, 3 Indian troops, 3 British troops, and the Afghans 200, until eventually a relief column arrived with some cannon and was able to beat the Afghan soldiers off. But it's very similar, yet completely not in history. And part of the reason for that, I think, Omar Korea did get the VC.
Oh, right.
He was the only one VC, not 11. But, I mean, it wasn't as... I think Rorke's Drift was perhaps a more desperate, just because of the numbers and perhaps the situation. They were defending a British post. But I think a very interesting political point is that before Rorke's Drift, there was this Sandalwana, a huge British defeat, an embarrassment for the British, especially seeing as Bartle Frere had gone in without the authority of his government or Queen. And you need, after something like that happens, which didn't happen very often with the British, but it did happen a few times, you need something for the newspapers back home to say, no, look, we're British.
Yeah. Look
at these few men, look what we did.
Yeah.
And that happened in Afghanistan as well, because you had the disaster in that war was Maiwand in July, was it July? Yes, end of July 1880, where thousands of Afghans almost wiped out a British column that was out in the desert and retreated ignominiously back to Kandahar.
Yeah.
And you had, in the aftermath of that, you had General Roberts marched 10,000 men from Kabul down to Kandahar in record time, 300 miles or so, and defeated Ayub Khan at Kandahar in a glorious victory.
Yeah.
But the thing that's remembered, the famous thing, at the time the famous thing was the march. And in fact, they even made a medal for the march, which led to resentment from other soldiers who said, well, I've been in Afghanistan for 2 years marching, my boots have been worn out, I've been shot at, I've, had Afghan tribesmen come into my tent and try to slit my throat. And they get this special medal for, march. And it was quite an operation. Yeah. Although the war was almost over, so they didn't have much. But the point is, that was played up. Yeah. And Maiwand was played down. Sandalwana was played down. Rorke's Drift was played up. Yeah. Give the VCs to kind of, blind everyone to the disaster that's just happened with all the, the shiny metal medals. Although actually now the thing that most people know about the Afghan war, or most people are interested in, is Maiwand. Yeah. That's there's a couple of books, one of which I was involved in, which have been written about Maiwand specifically, and that's the British disaster, and people are interested in disasters. And there was a follow-up to Zulu, a film called Zulu Dawn. Yeah. Which was made 100 years to the year in 1979, which was written by
Cy Enfield.
Yes.
He wrote the book and the script.
Right. Yeah. And it was a prequel, of course, because it's about Sandalwana.
Oh, right.
And I really like that film. In fact, when I first saw it, I thought, this is better than Zulu. Oh. But I don't know if it is dramatically. Yeah. It is a very good film. It's got quite a cast in it, and you do very much see the commanders in that one. Right. But it's much more technically accurate, perhaps. Oh, right. And so if you're interested in military history, I think that's got a lot going for it. It's probably, some South African Zulu War expert will probably say it's completely fictitious. But I haven't seen it for a while. I might watch it again soon just to have another check of it. But I was quite impressed by that. Perhaps I was too familiar with Zulu and this was new. Right, yeah. But looking at Zulu again recently for this podcast, it does stand the test of time, I think. And obviously it's an historical film, so it doesn't date. Yes, it's not a contemporary film that dates through fashion and special effects necessarily, although I did criticise the special effects earlier. But as a dramatic piece of art, it's relevant, very relevant, and it's good. Yeah. It's a good film. It is a classic, deservedly so, isn't it?
I think this is, of all the films we've seen so far, this one really shows you the sort of small details. Because the things that matter here are things like getting bullets to people. Yes. There's a scene where two injured men dragging around a box of bullets, giving them out, because you need to do that. Yeah. Whereas all the other ones have been about big things, bombs, blowing up bridges. Yes. But here you really get a feeling that each man matters and each tactical decision mess.
Yes.
So it's good from that point of view.
Yeah. I think the rest of the Zulu War played out with, I think Chelmsford, who was the general, actually out in the field, retreated from Zululand and then went back in for, I don't know if you'd call it a second campaign, but had to go back in again. And of course, the British eventually won. I think there was the Battle of Ulundi, and that finished off the Zulu independence, certainly.
Was it then the Boer War?
Well, the Boer War was 1899. I don't know if it was 98. So it was right at the turn of the century. I mean, obviously, all these wars, there's no isolated war. In fact, the Boer War of 1900, whatever it was, I can't remember, 1899, 9 to 1902, was the second Boer War.
Oh, right.
There was a Boer War, I think it was the 1870s, so not long before the Zulu War.
Oh, right.
Actually, the first Boer War might have been 1881, actually. Oh, my history is terrible. It was somewhere around then.
It's better than mine.
Well, Afghan War, ask me anything. Anything else? The first Boer War might have been 1881.
Right.
There was certainly some South African war then.
So basically, it wasn't a decided conflict. It just, like the Middle East, went on and on.
That's the thing. Why was the second Boer War? Now, I don't know much about the second Boer War, but it's attached. There's a string attached to that point in time that goes back, and you pull it, and that thread is linked to. It's wound around all kinds of historical events.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have had that Boer War if you hadn't had this. I mean, obviously, the tension with the Boers goes back to when the British came to the Cape in the 1790s or whenever it was.
Yeah.
Again, sorry, probably got the date wrong. And the Zulus, and of course we get all the indigenous peoples of South Africa to become British subjects and soldiers, and a lot of resentment. I mean, it's just storing up trouble. I mean, the Afghan War in 2001, 2002, whenever it was, till... Has it finished? Yeah. Till now, is still the Taliban are certainly making a comeback. Obviously, that was instigated by the 2001 attacks in New York, but the Afghan part of it, they see it as still connected to the possibly the war in 1919, definitely the war in 1878, and even perhaps more so the first one, which was the 1840s.
Right.
Yeah, they don't forget these things because they're big events in their history. Whereas for us, the British, we've been planting ourselves all over the world since, goodness knows when, 1400s or whenever it was. Yeah. And so it's just another thing. But to these people...
it's their home, isn't it?
It makes a massive difference. Yeah. So when the Afghans fight, they're remembering those reasons. They're very strong for them. Yeah. And we this is where you say you don't learn from history. Yeah. The Afghan War has been fought 4 times. The Anglo-Afghan War has been fought 4 times, pretty much for the same reason each time, and with the same effect almost every time. It's quite stunning. Anyway, I don't know much about the history of South Africa, but certainly this is a very small part of it that is very interesting and fascinating, and has had, as we said, books written about it. The film, which I don't know, this is an interesting thing actually. Would Rorke's Drift be almost forgotten historical event if it hadn't been for the film? It's possible.
It certainly sparked interest in it. I think.
Definitely. Nearly everyone I know who's interested in the Zulu War is through the film Zulu. Yeah. That's how they get into then the historical truth of it and become obsessed. So okay.
Yeah. So our next film is The Eagle Has Landed.
Michael Caine again.
Back to the Second World War.
He's playing a Nazi this time.
Yes.
So, I'm looking forward to that one. It's a bit of fiction, but I think it's going to be very interesting, perhaps be a bit more on solid ground, purely because we don't have to check it so much with historical fact, although there are historical allusions, and it's very interesting for that. Yeah. So, thank you very much for listening to the War Films Podcast Part 6, and hopefully it won't be too long before we get Part 7 going, and we'll see you then.
Yes. Bye.
fall.